Hey everybody, Milton Davis here. It is Wednesday, August 25th. We're continuing our celebration of Sword and Soul Month. This is my new presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed the discussion that we had last week. So tonight we are going to be talking about Sword and Soul world building. Before I get started, I want to thank everybody who've had the opportunity to go to our site and purchase our Sword and Soul books this month. For those of you who haven't been there, we have a sale on all of our Sword and Soul books, so go there and check it out. If you haven't read any Sword and Soul before, never read anything by me or any of my authors, this is a good time to go and check it out. Also, for those who ordered pre-ordered, where is it at? I just put it away from here. Um, Fallen, the paperback version, is finally in. So if you pre-ordered, your books will be shipping tomorrow on Thursday. If you haven't ordered it yet, here's a great opportunity to go by the site and get it. So let's talk about world building. World building has been something that's been very popular over the past few years. As people start to get more and more into fantasy, you've been seeing more and more discussions about world building. You know, people look at things like Lord of the Rings. They look at things like Game of Thrones, and they think about the world building that went behind it. And so it's something that a lot of people are interested in, and a lot of different authors have given their opinion and some details and some advice on world building. I had the opportunity to read a book by Stant Latore titled "Worlds, Right Worlds Your Readers Won't Forget." And Stant does a great job at outlining the different things you need to consider for general world building. He also has little exercises at the end of the chapters to kind of give you some an opportunity to test out some of the theories or some of the concepts that he presents in his book. And it's an excellent book. If you're looking for a place to start on world building, I would take a look at that. But let's talk specifically about Sword and Soul / African fantasy world building. Just from the name of it, you automatically know that this is a world building that's going to be highly influenced by the continent of Africa. In my case, and when it comes to Sword and Soul, I'm looking at specifically pre-colonial Africa. And okay, Africa is a huge continent. Over 3,000 different cultures, different languages. So when you look at the continent, it's kind of like where do I start? You know, if I'm going to be using one of these cultures as the basis for my stories or for my fiction that I'm working on, where do I start? Now that's a question I can't answer for you. When I started doing my research in the 90s, when I was first doing research looking for books, the African culture that I found the most information on was the Zulu culture. The British love to write about the Zulus. I mean, they have a thing about people who kick their behinds a few times, and so they did all kind of research on the Zulus. Excuse me, I got a cough. But anyway, so that was the culture that I found the most information on. But I knew there was more to be had, so I kept my research going. And over the years, I was able to find a lot of information on a lot of different cultures, and I'm still finding information to this day. So most of your fiction that you find is based on existing cultures. For instance, Robert E. Howard based a lot of his background for Conan from Europe during the Dark Ages. I happened to come across a book about the Celts, and as I'm reading this book, I see all these different names of different cultures that Robert E. Howard used in Conan. And then I come to find out, I think he was also an anthropology major, so he had that foundation to do his research. Charles Saunders, the founder of Sword and Soul, based his cultures that are around in Morrow on ancient African civilizations, on the Kush and different in Songhai and Mali, different places like that. And I did the same thing myself when I started writing my books. So using these different cultures as a foundation to give you some influence on your stories is one of the best ways to start. A question might come at what makes a African-based world distinct from a European-based world. So that's another good question to ask. I will start by using the process that I did when I developed my first book, which is Meiji. Meiji was a result of all the research I had done from the 90s up to the point that I wrote the book. And when I first started the book, I was looking at specifically something that would be influenced mainly by Zulu culture. But as I learned more and more over the years, I decided I wanted this to be a fictional story that represented the continent. So I wanted to pull information from different cultures from around Africa, from all throughout Africa, and bring them together in this story. So on the surface, it's a fiction story, but but deeper down, it's actually I call it my homage to my heritage, to my African heritage, and to the continent. And that's what Meiji was supposed to be. Specifically, Meiji was supposed to be if you found, if you talk to the people who eventually become a culture by the end of Meiji, and you ask them how did they come to be, Meiji would be the story that they would tell you. That would be their origin story to tell you how they became a people, and that was my objective when I wrote the book. So let's look at some of the things that you would be looking at when you're talking about doing world building. Um, one of the specific things that I do from a bare bones is trying to decide how the culture is going to be. And I totally just went to looking at different cultures. I pulled heavily on Zulu culture when I developed Meiji, when it came to developing the Seisu. So much so that I was able to find actual ceremony that the Zulu people did in order to confirm their Nkosi, and I used that particular celebration specifically in the book, hoping that hopefully if someone who was of Zulu culture read the book, they would see it and they would recognize it for what it was. When it came to the Moana people, the Moana were basically a composite culture. I took from the Ashanti culture, I took from the Yoruba culture. I basically focused on cultures in West Africa, and I took little things from here and there, and then created this culture. So when you're developing a culture, some of the things that you're looking at when you're developing a world is some of the things that you look in our world. What do they value? What are the people's religion? What is their social economic structure? Different things like that. And I looked heavily on, like, again, on African cultures to get that information and to influence what I was doing, and how I was solving these problems. One of the things, and this is one thing I want to do through this, I want to touch on some things that I feel like that aren't considered as much. One of the things that I don't see considered as much as it should be, I think, is the geography of the area that your people live in. When you pick a world and when you decide where your culture and where your story is going to take place, to me, it's really important to look at the geography, the weather, different things like that, how the geography affects the culture and stuff like that. This book was very influential to me. It was called The Geography Behind History. And in this particular book, the author basically looked at different things that happened in history and talked about how the geography affected how these things happened. One example was he used in World War II when French built the Maginot Line. They built it up to a particular forest, to the Ardennes, and they were saying, well, we don't need to build it further than the Ardennes because nobody can go through the Ardennes. And back in the day, before people had certain types of technology, there were places that you couldn't pass. You couldn't go through this area because the forest was too thick. You couldn't go through this area because the mountains were too high. You couldn't ford the river because it was too deep. And that's why you had different places that you had to find the ford. The Cumberland, if you've ever traveled up the east coast of the United States and you see the Cumberland Gap, you'll see a situation where you've got mountains running and people trying to get to the other side of these mountains, and like, okay, the mountains are too high, we can't get there. Then you find this gap, this huge gap, and that was the main passageway that American settlers used to go to beyond the Appalachians because of this gap. So different things like that were significant to people during that time. Another aspect of how geography affects culture or weather is that one thing that I discovered is that the reason that it's raining most of the time, or it's always wet on the time in Seattle and places like Portland, is because you have these mountains that when the weather effects come in, they run into the mountains and they get stopped there. They stop right there. Now on the other side of these mountains, you basically have what is called a high desert, because the rain doesn't get there because it basically runs into the mountains and stuff. So this is another way how geography affects people's culture, and that and the environment that you're developing in your world. So whenever you put mountains and rivers and deserts and different things like that, also take a look at how those different physical features are going to affect the culture, affect the what your characters have to deal with when in that world. Another example is that something that I had read about, but I got kind of a vicarious example of it from my nephew. Was when he was living in Ghana. You have a thing in this part of Africa called Hadaman, and basically this is like winds that are blowing off the Sahara. So during that time of the year, you've got sand and stuff coming through the country that's blowing in from the Sahara and stuff. And so that's something that affects, of course, what people are doing during that time and things like that. So if your world building is so detailed, well, these are the type of details that you need in order to help fill in and make your world feel more realistic. That's what you have to consider. If I put a river here, what does that mean? If I put mountains here on my map, what does that mean? If I decide to put a desert there, what does that mean? Geography also kind of affects the attitude of people. One thing that I've noticed in general is that whenever you have areas in a country, in a world where there are mountains, the people who live in the mountains tend to be pretty much isolated, and they tend to be broken up into smaller clans because traveling from one valley to another valley is difficult. So you have people that end up being almost literally enclosed in a particular valley, and it leads to a development of a hardy people and a certain mentality that seems to be pervasive around the entire world. And then also when you look at the case of steppes, open area, and you look at people like nomads, and you see how that living in those areas where it's difficult to raise crops and you have to move from place to place in order to survive, it develops a certain type of mentality, a certain type of culture among the people. For a long time in Europe, the best fighters were people that came from the steppes, the Mongols, the Mamluks, and different people like that. So a lot of times we don't consider this when we're writing our stories, but when we develop these physical features, we also need to take a time and look at how these physical features are going to affect the culture that you're living in. I am not a outlining type person. Anybody that knows me has heard me say this time and time again. I'm a pantser. So when I do my world building, I'm usually doing the least amount of world building necessary in order for me to get my story going. I fill in the blanks as I get to certain parts of the story where I have to understand what's going to happen or how this is going to affect the particular culture. And that's when I'll sit down and say, okay, I need to know more about this region. I need to know more about this situation so I can see how it's going to affect my characters, or how it's going to basically enrich this particular section or chapter that I'm working on. And then I'll go back and do that. And a lot of people do after the fact. Now, do you draw a map? That depends on the author. Charles Saunders had an ideal of Nyumbani in his mind, but he never drew a map of Nyumbani. If you go online, you will see Nyumbani maps, but these are maps that other people have created based on the descriptions that Charles gave in the Amaro books. I did a Meiji map, and I actually did that map after I wrote the book. And when I was doing my revision, because as I was talking about my characters traveling to different places, I had to have an idea of where those places were. I can show you the map that's in the book. You'll see it after I focus for a little while, but that's the map. That's the Meiji map, and I actually drew that map after I wrote the book when I was doing my revision. And getting back to geography a little bit, when we're thinking about pre-colonial times and we're thinking about how people traveled and stuff like that, you got to realize that we're not talking about cars, we're not talking about places that had highways. We had trails and different things like that. But you have to take into consideration certain stuff. Like some of the things that I found is that the average person could travel 10 miles a day, and that was about it. Even if you had an animal or something like that, 10 miles a day was mostly the extreme that people could travel. There were exceptions, but in general, that's what you see. If you look at a map of Georgia, and it was interesting because when I drive home, I drive down a road that's called Highway 85, and home for me is Columbus, Georgia. And as I drive down these back roads, the thing that I notice is that most of the towns along this route are approximately 10 miles apart. So it kind of reflects the fact that when people were traveling from Atlanta to Columbus, you had these towns 10 miles apart. So you always had a place to stop once you reached the limit of how far you could travel during that day. And when people say the world's bigger, you think about that. Atlanta is 100 miles from Columbus, Georgia. I can drive that in an hour and a half. If I was to have to travel from Atlanta to Columbus, Georgia, with a horse or by walking, it would basically take me 10 days to make that trip. So again, this is something that you consider when you're developing worlds from a pre-colonial standpoint. When you start having your people travel from place to place, you wanted something that would be realistic in what humans would be able to do during that time. Now there were some exceptions, like people talked about the Zulu army could march 50 miles in a day. But this is a disciplined group of people who have trained to do this. This is not your average person that's loading up stuff on their back and they're deciding to go visit their relatives that live in the next town, that kind of thing. So, but you can make exceptions, and sometimes by doing that, that probably would give an example of the people that you're working with in your story being exceptional people, because they can do these things that are outside what people would normally do. So when you're looking at it's hard for people to develop. Well, in the past, it has been hard for people to develop stories based on African culture because of the limited amount of information out there. The majority of the information that I gathered when I first started was from books that I found online. A lot of the books were basically out of print. I had to buy them used, and I bought books and collected them. These days, I lean heavily on the internet. Like people say, Google is your friend, and you can find just about anything. The thing, though, however, you have to do is that you have to check that source with other sources to kind of get an idea of what you're getting is actually something that you can use that would be in a story that you can rely on. One of the things that I had an issue with when I was creating my African-based worlds was knowing how people lived, what they lived in, and I found this great little book. Let me find it over here. This one right here. It's called African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest. And what this author does is that he basically goes and looks at what the original dwellings that people lived in different parts of Africa during that time. As Europeans coming to Africa, because things weren't the way that they thought they should be, they felt like these dwellings that Africans used were inferior to what they were doing. But actually, what they were looking at, and they weren't comprehending that the different dwellings that Africans lived in were perfectly suited for the environments in which they lived and for the materials that they had available to build. The other misconception that you get with when you talk about African cultures is that the concept of cities. There were very large cities in different parts of Africa. There were stone cities in Africa, well beyond Egypt and what we think has happened. But a lot of these cities, especially in West Africa, were destroyed by the British when they took over, when they colonized these areas. And a lot of the cities in the east, the mentality was so bad that when people came across Great Zimbabwe, they kept thinking it was the lost town of Prester John, this mythical Christian character that was supposed to have left Europe and settled and established a city somewhere else. So every time the Europeans found something that was outside of Europe in Africa that was stone or technology, so they would say, "Oh, it's Prester John," that kind of thing. So you have to dig through a lot of those misconceptions and stuff in order to get to the root of things and get to the truth of things and start to help develop some of your worlds and things like that. When it comes to cultures, like I said, there are so many different cultures in Africa. The ones that I ended up choosing for my world building basically was, like I mentioned, the Zulu. I also leaned heavily on the empires of Mali and Songhai. Currently now we're doing a lot of work in East Africa, so I'm looking at the kingdom of Makuria. And so in between that, I found information about different cultures as well, and it gave me some type of insight on the day-to-day lives. Another aspect that you really need to take into consideration when you're doing world building is faith. How do people in your world worship? Do they worship? If they do, what is their religious or spiritual structure? And if you're creating something on pre-colonial African basis, you're going to be dealing with situations where you're going to be dealing with something that's outside of especially in West Africa, that doesn't include Christianity or may not include Islam. Both religions have been in Africa for a long time. Actually, Christianity was established in the African continent before Islam. When you look at East Africa, and both have had a heavy influence on the areas that they exist in now. But you also have your indigenous African cultures, and what that means when you're dealing with indigenous African cultures and indigenous African faiths, it means letting go of some of the concepts and the notions that you have in order to embrace what these spiritualities have to offer. And if you're going to be creating cultures that are true to that, the best way is to do it in a way that you are honoring and respecting these different faiths and different cultures and that type of thing. The concepts that we have in our mind coming from a Judeo-Christian background are not the same when you're applying that to indigenous African faiths and religions, and you need to take that into consideration. A book that kind of started me on my journey was this book that I had right here. It's called African Religions and Philosophies, where the author actually takes a broad view of the different spirituality systems in Africa and kind of shows you where some of the similarities and things like that. And it kind of gave me some incentive on to looking at deeper. Luckily, I had a chance in one respect to meet Balogun Ojetade, who is a Yoruba priest, and he helped me a lot on understanding the Yoruba faith system. I actually had a book that I thought I understood, but I think I had a chance to talk to Balogun, I learned otherwise. But again, these are things that run in that will show that will distinguish your African world building from what you would get, which would be Eurocentric. One of the things that pops up in just about every African-based world building pre-colonial system that I've seen from different authors, even authors who don't know each other and they embarked on it on, is the strong vein of spirituality in the stories, and it's reflected by everyone. So you can tell that everybody's doing their work and they're coming to these same conclusions, and it's reflected in all of their works. Everybody that I've read that writes African fantasy or sword and soul, you see that same common thread throughout their stories, and it's something that as a author that you need to take a look and do the research time. Do not use examples like Tarzan and the deepest, darkest Africa stuff and all that kind of stuff like that. Do the research. The books are out there in plain sight, and it's a matter of sitting down, reading them, setting aside all your preconceived notions of what you believe or what you should be, and really understanding and respecting the cultures. Another thing that I do once I pick a culture to base my fantasy on, I look at that. I do the research. Let me show you here. I do the research, and what I do is I pull names from that culture as well. This was the first book that I purchased on African. It was called The Book of African Names. It was the first book that I purchased. I have another book that actually is a much better book than this one, but I've used it so much that it's like it's ragged, And the thing I also do is when I pick names for my cultures, for my characters, the names that I pick are usually names that the definition of the names reveals something about the character themselves, because that is a tradition among many African cultures that you just don't name a child arbitrarily. When you name that child, that name has power, and that name has meaning to it. So I do the same thing when I pick the names of my characters. You can read one of my books and you can just enjoy it on a surface level. But the more you know about African culture and the different African cultures, the richer the book will be, because you'll come across things that you'll know that will reflect, what these different cultures and what they believe in. And it always always makes me smile when I run into people who have read stories that I've written that were based on their particular culture, and they see that reflected in there, and they send me an email or something like that to talk about that. Another thing that you want to do too is you want to take time to look into the folklore and the traditions of different cultures. I got this book one of the first books I bought by Harold Corlander called A Treasury of African Folklore. And the thing I like about this book is that Mr. Corlander actually divides the folklore into the by the cultures that he gathered it from. So, for instance, where is it at? I'll show you an example here. Here, this is the section about the Akan people from Ghana. What he does, he gives you a brief explanation about the culture, and then he proceeds to just put in, different information, folklore information that he gathered from those particular cultures. Knowing this folklore again is something that teaches you something about the value and the what the culture values, what's important to them by reading their folklore, and it gives you a voice and a tone for those people. So when you're looking at your world that you build, you can kind of use that as a basis. And so the sayings that people talk, the way that they talk, the way that they refer to different things, all this is reflected in their culture and is reflected in their folk tales. So by reading their folk tales, you kind of get a sense of that, and it helps you make that culture distinct when you're having the characters talking. Even when you have those characters interacting with different cultures in your stories, you can basically show the differences in the cultures, basically maybe by the way people dress, by the way that they move, different things like that will show up because you've done the research. Another thing I would stress on when you're doing research for African world building is please try to find historical books from the cultures that you're researching. There's a lot of books on African history. There's a lot of books by British authors, and not to knock the British authors, some of them are very good and some of them are sincere. But it's hard to write about another culture without injecting some of your own preconceived notions into those cultures. So when you read those type of historians, a lot of times you will get those type of that type of angle when you're reading about their cultures. Now I've been told by some archaeologists that the best thing to do is read stuff that are written by archaeologists, because archaeologists, they just base it on the evidence that they find, and they're not influenced by cultural biases and stuff like that. They're just they're making their statements on what they find. And I do have a number of books that were written by archaeologists, and I will have to tell you, my advice would be bring your patience. Sometimes they're very dry, but when you're digging through all of them, you do find some very good information. A lot of the information that I learned about the Swahili city-states, especially the early Swahili states, was information that was gathered by archaeologists who studied the sites of Swahili cities that no longer exist, like Pemba. But through their archaeological research, they were able to discover some interesting things that I was able to incorporate in some of my stories. A couple of examples of books that are a history of books that come from African sources would be this one, which I have to excuse the condition of it, but again, it's one of those books I use a lot, is Pre-Colonial Black Africa by Sheikh Anta Diop. It's actually one of the first books that I picked up by an African historian to influence my reading. A couple of other books I actually I had them posted up, but I don't have them with me now, are the Tariq al-Fataj and the Tariq al-Sudan. These are actually historical books that talk about the Kingdom of Mali, which was one of the Sahelian kingdoms. And the significant thing about these books is they were both written by Songhai historians during the time period of the existence of the empire, or not long after that. So what you're getting here is historical information from the source, from the people themselves, which is unembellished by outside sources or influenced by any outside opinions. Of course, there will be some opinions because they are Songhai and they are writing about their culture. But what you're getting there is the history in their words, and that is and you can't get any better than that. So those are just a couple examples of ideas. So I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but basically what I would say is make sure you got good sources. Make sure that when you're developing these worlds that you're basing them on the traditions and the values and the spirituality of those particular cultures, not what you think of them, but what they think of themselves. And for some people, that's going to mean setting aside your prejudices or setting aside your preconceived notions and really looking and doing what us writers are supposed to do. Get into that character, feel that, get the feel that that character would feel about that, not what you would think about it, but what that character would feel about it. A couple of and I guess that means really respecting the source, respecting what you're writing about, being true to the source and what the source tells you, and make sure that your characters are reacting to situations in a way in the culture that you built, in the culture that they're reflecting, not necessarily a 20th century or 21st century mindset in a 6th century situation. If you are working in a situation where you want things to be different, then make sure you include that into your culture so it won't stand out, or that you have a character that, because of who they are able to kind of buck the system. Two of the and then I'll wrap it up. Two of the things that one of the differences I wanted to show you guys as far as world building is concerned. I showed you Meiji earlier, and I told you that Meiji was actually a situation where I developed a world based on different African cultures and put it together. The other, another aspect of it would be Changa Safari. Changa Safari is a historical fantasy. So in the case of Changa Safari, I was actually basing the book on actual cultures that existed in Africa and around the world during that time. So the world building there was a little easier because I was basically just researching those particular cultures and creating them the way that they were during the 15th century. Even the magic that I used and different things that happened in the fantasy aspect of it was based on the folklore and the fantasy and the folklore and the beliefs of those particular areas during that time period. So and that took a lot of research, not only in East African culture and in West African culture, but I also had to research, Indian culture and Chinese culture in order to, so when Changa was in those different areas, I wanted to make sure that what was happening there would have been reflective of the times as they were, not the times that they are right now. So what was the result of this? You can only do so much. People will you're always going to have people that are going to question your decisions, but that's where the creativity comes in. That's where you build your world and you draw your conclusions based on how you feel things will go. And if your world is solid enough, and if you've done the work right, the reader will become lost in your world, and they will accept what you give them because everything that you put together is logical and makes sense. I had two situations where my research was tested. The first was at my alma mater, Fort Valley State College. When I first finished Meiji, I was invited down by Anna Holloway, who was my English instructor in college, and to present the book to their creative writing class there. And during the presentation, there was a gentleman in the audience who was from Zimbabwe, and he really gave me a hard time. I mean, he was asking me some really hard questions, and I'm sitting there saying to myself, man, this guy must not really like what I'm doing because he's really, asking me these questions. He's really grilling me on this thing, So, we went a little back and forth. It was amicable. After it was over, he came to me, and I was like, oh man, this guy's he's gonna keep this thing going. But he told me the reason he was asking me the questions because he teaches a creative writing class, and some of his students were there, and he wanted them to really understand the process of creating a novel or a short story. And as opposed to, and then when we started to talk about Meiji, he actually told me, he said, well, I think you really did a real good job on your research. I can tell you did a lot of research. The things that you were talking about were things that I know personally from being from the continent, from Zimbabwe. So I was like, cool, so I did all right. My other example was I met a professor from Tuskegee who was from the Congo. And he actually was a friend of my sister's, and she had my copy of Meiji at her house. And he saw it sitting there, and he's like, well, what is this? And she said, oh, it's a book my brother wrote, Meiji. And so he picked it up and read it. And she said he sat there and read the entire book while he was at her house. And when he was done, he actually said, has your brother ever been to Africa? And she said, no. He said, well, this is amazing because some of the stuff that he's talking about in this book is stuff that I used to do in my village growing up in the Congo and stuff like that. So I finally got a chance to meet him and talk to him, and it was a really good conversation. He actually, brought me some stuff from his home village in the Congo, and really increased my knowledge on in his particular area about his culture and stuff like that. And those are the interactions that make the world building and the research all worthwhile, when you get the chance to meet people who are from the regions that you are highlighting, and they see what you're doing, and they think that you're doing it the right way. So that's the end of my rambling as far as sword and soul world building. I hope you guys learned something from it. I didn't expect this. I didn't mean for this to be a course. Just kind of give you a few ideas of what to consider when you're developing a world based on African pre-colonial African cultures, and I give you a starting point. Again, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of information on the internet. It's all about setting up your world. Getting the details together, considering the geography and the nature and different things like that. And most of all, it's about respecting the culture and respecting the people that you are looking at and that you're using for the basis of your fiction. So I'm Milton Davis, MV Media. You guys, I hope you guys continue to celebrate Sword and Soul Month, and I will see you soon. Sword and Soul forever. Peace.